We are recording this presentation, so if you are uh, a little sidetracked as I just was, you'll be able to see a recording of this posted on our website, usually within about a week. I already answered a question about that in the chat, so if you go and check there, you'll see the web link to where this webinar and all of our webinars are posted. This is actually our fifth webinar in our series on New York School Bus Incentive Program. Previous webinars were specific to applying for the bus voucher and the charging voucher, in addition to our last one, which was on fleet electrification planning, a key part of our process. I did note that we had less attendees at that one. And I think maybe partially because now we're back to talking about money, so folks are interested in hearing about that. So definitely, tune in today. But if you did miss the fleet electrification planning one, feel free to go back and check that out, and see what kind of support we can offer on that. I will continue to beat that drum today throughout the presentation, because it does, it is beneficial and also helps you prepare for applying for incentives too. All right. We one other note on housekeeping, just we have in the past answered questions in the chat throughout the presentation. We're a little bit shorter staffed today, so I'll be looking through those at the end of the presentation and answering those during the Q&A period. If I don't get to your question, you can feel free to follow up at schoolbus@nyserda.ny.gov, and I will get you an answer for sure. Okay, let's get started. We're talking about combining the New York School Bus Incentive Program with other funding sources, also known as stacking. And today, me, Vincent Rashika, I'll be joined by Michelle Levinson from the World Resources Institute and Allison Kling from Con Edison to talk about different components. We're going to go cameras off for the presentation so as not to distract you. But we'll probably come back on for the Q&A period. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to give an overview of the different types of incentives that are available. As I'm sure you've seen throughout your research, there's a variety of different types of incentives, each of which have, different program requirements. Also, different timing related to when you would apply for them, and different application processes. We're going to provide a few tips in terms of things to consider when you're stacking funds, so applying for different programs, and also talk about the total cost of operation or ownership. This is a really important point. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the upfront costs and how to reduce those, because that is really a main focus of folks trying to start this transition right now. But total cost of ownership and operation is really important to factor in, and Michelle's going to talk a bit about that. In addition to that, there are some changes to how things have been operating in New York State. We have the state budget passed in April, and those changes will actually impact total cost of ownership in addition to the upfront costs for school district. We're also working with our affiliate, the New York Green Bank, in trying to find ways to improve financing for school districts or find different financing solutions. So that's just something to consider as we get through this. We're trying to figure out ways to support both upfront costs and also operational costs. Many of your school districts are supported by utilities that participate in the Make Ready pilot program. That program can provide funding for grid upgrades and also site upgrades. And so we're going to talk through the sort of the workflow of how you apply for both the New York School Bus Incentive charging voucher and the Make Ready funding. We'll give a few examples of how stacking funding looks from an upfront cost perspective and also a total cost perspective. And then we'll do questions and share a few resources at the end. Again, we'll post these slides afterwards. Okay, next slide, please. So just probably a recap for most folks, and also just to flag that this information, it came straight out of our electric school bus guidebook, guide on financial incentives. Um, that that guide is actually slightly out of date based on new incentive programs being offered, but we are in the process of updating that and should have a new version of that soon. You can find that on our website as well. Um, so yeah, there are tax credits, vouchers, rebates, and grants. Tax credits, are exactly what they sound like. For the caveat here is that for many school districts who are tax exempt, the main programs that you should be looking at are available as a direct payment instead of a tax exemption. So even if you're tax exempt, you can still claim these credits. They include the IRS 30C and 45W credits. One is for clean vehicles. So electric school buses are considered clean vehicles in that commercial clean vehicles in that program, which means up to $40,000 can be reduced off of the purchase price of an electric school bus. And then the other one is more about your bus depots, places where you're going to be charging your buses. That's called the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Refueling Property Credit. Really easy to say name, but essentially you can get up to $100,000 back for installing charging infrastructure. The next and potentially largest component based on our program is the voucher component. So the New York School Bus Incentive Program provides bus and charging vouchers. These vouchers essentially the bus vouchers are actually paid to the vendor, so your bus dealer who'll be selling the bus, and that voucher is then removed from the total sale price of the vehicle. We structured it that way to essentially reduce the amount of effort that's needed for the applicants, so you as the school district or contractor, um, and make the process a little bit smoother. It enables you to receive the benefit of the incentive without laying out any money to be reimbursed. And so that's how we've set that up for those reasons. Rebates are similar. The Clean School Bus program that the EPA runs is a rebate, partially a rebate program. So in the case of Clean School Bus program, those rebates are also available ahead of purchase after the presentation of a purchase order. And then the last type are grants. These are usually bigger programs with potentially more funding available through them. They do require quite a bit more effort and are usually administered on a competitive basis. So you apply, and all the applications are sort of graded, and the grantees are selected based on a competitive process. Next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of the primary ways of funding electric school buses and infrastructure, what the programs are and what they cover and don't cover. The green indicates which programs cover which funding areas, and then the red are those that are not covered. So as I mentioned, our New York School Bus Incentive Program is a voucher, and it can cover buses, chargers, and then site upgrades, things that are needed on site to enable chargers to operate. The Clean School Bus grant and rebate programs also cover those same areas: buses, chargers, and site upgrades. Recently announced one-off program, the EPA Clean Heavy Duty program, is the same. The utility make ready programs that we'll be talking about today can cover site upgrades and grid upgrades. Importantly, this is really the primary focus in terms of getting utility or grid upgrades covered through this program. The tax credits we talked about can cover buses and chargers. And then New York State Aid, which we'll talk a little bit about, is a reimbursement, so different from these upfront funding programs, as you all probably know, but they can cover things like buses, chargers, and site upgrades as well. Next slide, please. So just quickly, when you're applying for incentive programs, there's a variety of things to consider, and different ways that we examine eligibility. So things like prioritization are considered. In some programs, the program may be only open to certain types of school districts or districts in disadvantaged communities or underserved areas. That is not the case with the New York School Bus Incentive Program. I just want to clarify that up front because we've been seeing some conflicting information on this, but New York School Bus Incentive Program is available to all public school districts providing transportation for students. That's true if you purchase and operate your own buses, or if you contract out your service to a third party. Some of the other programs are limited. In our program, we do have additional funds available for priority districts, those that are serving disadvantaged communities or our high need school districts. But yeah, New York School Bus Incentive Program is available to all districts. Want to make sure that that's hammered home today. School district type, I mentioned sort of high need, low need, whether you're rural or urban, things like that can factor in to some programs. Ownership, as I mentioned, directly owned buses versus contractor owned buses are some distinguishing factors, but also whether you purchase or lease a vehicle. Currently, we cannot fund lease vehicles, but that's something that we're looking into trying to change as part of our New York School Bus Incentive Program. We want to make sure that districts are getting served with both buses and chargers that will meet their needs and continue to function and function in a safe way. So we do have requirements in terms of what vehicles are eligible for our program and what minimum requirements are needed for chargers as well. In terms of the procurement process, some programs might offer the ability to cover buses and chargers, and other equipment. So, how you sort of procure your equipment might change a little bit. There are scrappage requirements for vehicles in the EPA programs. Our program has a bonus for scrapping, so it's not required. But when you're thinking about different programs, if you're applying for the EPA, you want to make sure you're meeting those scrappage requirements as well. I mentioned lease and purchase mechanism, and then usage requirements. A lot of programs do include the required reporting period after the vehicle or charger or infrastructure is purchased to ensure that it's continuing to operate in the way it was intended and the funding is used to support clean vehicles. Next slide. So this is a quick overview of just how New York School Bus Incentive Program works with the EPA Clean School Bus Program. Both programs provide funding for the purchase of zero-emission electric school buses, and also can cover things like chargers, infrastructure, and installation in some components. So there's a lot of overlap between our programs. Our focus as a state is to be able to bring in as much federal money into New York State as possible. And the benefit of that is obviously that we're able to stretch how far the New York School Bus Incentive Program can go in terms of covering vehicles and chargers. So we want to encourage districts to apply to both programs. The way we're doing that is by providing what we're calling a stacking voucher. I will note that this process will go into place after July 1st, 2024. Up until that point, basically acknowledging that some districts have already applied for the EPA program, and we should be hearing about those awards pretty soon. But in the case that those awards are influencing how districts have structured their local budget votes next week. We're evaluating those on a case-by-case basis. But after July 1st, 2024, if you receive an EPA award, you would be awarded a stacking voucher through our New York School Bus Incentive Program, which basically means whatever amount you get from the EPA award, we will add either up to 50,000 or up to 100,000 on top of that amount. So regardless of your priority status, your the stacking amount, so the combined amount for the EPA and NYSBIP program would be higher than applying to either program individually. So huge benefit in applying, can significantly increase the amount that is covered upfront, and obviously then reduce the out-of-pocket cost to the district. If you've already applied for a New York School Bus Incentive Program, you can still apply for EPA, and we coordinate closely with the EPA on these applications, so we'll know that you're applying to both, and then would be able to recalculate your award amount for NYSBIP. I mentioned that both programs do also cover charging. The way the EPA structures it right now, charging is included in the total award amount. So we enable folks who have applied for stacking vouchers to also apply for our charging voucher. What this does is it enables all or more of the money from the EPA to go toward the bus, and then you still have a significant amount of funding to cover the charging side. And we'll offer a similar type of stacking voucher for the EPA's Clean Heavy Duty program, which I mentioned is active right now. It's a grant program, but we offer a similar type of stacking. Okay, we can go on to the next slide, please. So just some key considerations in different areas. I foreshadowed this up front, but fleet electrification planning is really important. We can cover up to 100% of the cost of a fleet electrification plan. We did another webinar on all of the characteristics and components of that process, so I'm not going to go into detail here. You can check that on our website, but essentially, the reason you want to do this is because it helps you identify which buses and routes you want to prioritize and what type of infrastructure you want to purchase, including chargers. So when it comes time to apply to these programs, you have a better sense of how you're going to apply and what type of technologies will be funded by the program. When you're applying for federal grants, the Fleet Electrification Plan not only gives you information that you can include in your application, but also shows that you've been completing work. You're not starting from scratch. A lot of these federal grant programs like to see projects that are, a term they used to use or use still is called shovel ready. Maybe not necessarily the case when you're buying a bus, but showing that you're ready to do this and you have the administrative capability to purchase and operate these buses is really helpful. So the FEP helps with that. It also informs and actually sort of serves as a vehicle for your initial conversations with your utility provider. So the engineering consultants that you work with will actually lead you through the process of that first conversation or series of conversations with your utility to determine what type of upgrades are needed and ensure that if you're eligible for incentive programs that you're aware of those as well. And as I always mention, creating an FEP will unlock more funding. You can apply for more buses after you've completed your FEP, and also it offers you another $30,000 on your charging voucher once the FEP is completed. Next slide, please. Right, so on the buses, some key considerations. Our New York School Bus Incentive Program is available at any time on a first come, first served basis. I know, the amount $100 million has been talked about a lot publicly, but the total program is $500 million. It's available as long as funds last, and so you can apply at any time for those programs. For our New York School Bus Incentive Program. Federal programs are announced on sort of what they call rounds or on a cyclical basis, so they're open at certain times throughout the year. Um, as I mentioned, the timing is something to consider, but not necessarily stop you from applying to either program. We'll always be able to figure out if we need to make modifications to award amounts, and have that flexibility with the support from our Voucher Help Center. Um, as I mentioned, federal programs are not always open, so signing up for those mailing email lists and notifications on those programs is really important. We try to communicate that out through our mailing list as well, but um, keeping aware of those funding programs and when you can apply is really helpful. Next slide, please. So I also mentioned that, our New York School Bus Incentive Program can cover some of the costs of charging infrastructure and site upgrades, and that utility make-ready programs also can cover some of those upfront costs on the charging side. Utility make-ready programs do not cover the charger themselves, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about this in a moment, but utility program is really the one you want to factor in when you're thinking about um, your broader projects. So, you're purchasing and installing charging for one or two buses right now. That might not trigger an upgrade to the grid, but further down the line, when you're scaling up to a larger fleet, there might need to be some grid side upgrades, and the utility program is what you would use to help cover some of those costs. Um, Again, the fleet electrification plan helps unlock additional funding. I mentioned that $30,000 can go towards site upgrades. Things like installing wiring conduit, a new panel, potentially battery storage, and things like that as well. And it's important in terms of timing to remember that charging projects are reimbursed after installation, as opposed to the bus voucher, which is paid up front. But in addition to factoring that in terms of financing, you also need to remember that permits are required from the New York State Education Department, and they must be secured ahead of redeeming your charging vouchers because they're required before installation. That may seem obvious, but that's the case. There are some changes to that process and potential exemptions for more straightforward installations. So I included some links on NYSED's website here too for you to take a look at. Next slide, please. So state aid. Yeah, most electric school bus related expenses are covered by transportation aid. A recent change now includes solar canopies, so a portion of your solar installation, if you're doing that specifically for charging buses at your depot, can be covered by state aid. I think that's a really useful thing to know. I mean, the direct solar to bus charging isn't necessarily always feasible based on when buses are charged, but if you incorporate battery storage, which is potentially covered by our New York School Bus Incentive Program and transportation aid, you can really reduce your impact on the grid and potentially reduce some costs with grid upgrades. I mentioned this earlier, but our New York School Bus Incentive Program is funded by the Environmental Bond Act, and that funding is now eligible for state aid. So it changes the calculation a little bit. We didn't include this in our examples today because we want to make sure we get the calculations right. But essentially, what it's going to result in is an increase in the amount of aid you returned on your bus over the 12-year amortization period. And in some cases, it might actually result in a net zero cost for school districts, meaning that all aid, all of the upfront costs that they put down will be paid back over those 12 years. So that's a huge change for school districts, uh, and really beneficial in terms of how far the New York School Bus Incentive Fund incentive program funding can go. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle for a second to talk about total costs of ownership.
Hey, thanks, Vinny, so much. And yeah, I think already this has been really wonderful. You know, you've been, as you said, you've been speaking to these ups, and those are, what everyone is thinking about when they're looking to get a vehicle. But we really encourage folks to also think about the total costs here. And, we see that as kind of critical to understanding and appropriately assessing the budget impact for each vehicle option. As you've probably observed, electric school buses do have a higher capital cost than diesel and other vehicle counterparts, but we often and regularly see lower fuel and lower maintenance costs. So this really means that getting an electric bus will hit your balance sheet differently than diesel buses do. And over time, this can, and again, we do observe this can generate savings for districts. So here we've been talking about pairing these savings with funding sources like the state's incentive program, like EPA's Clean School Bus program, and as tax incentives and, even compensation from utilities for participating in utility programs or even potentially providing vehicle to grid services. And, when you bring these all together, you can end up with a very compelling package, which we'll show in a little bit. But really we see that understanding total cost is about laying the groundwork for your district or your contracting organization to wholly consider the benefits and trade-offs when you make this transition. So in the next slide, I'll just speak to, if you can move to the next slide. Thank you. I'll speak to the key components here. So, the first step is to really identify the cost components. And these are things like annual mileage, maintenance and repair costs of your existing fleet, fuel and energy costs, etc. And today, with the figures we'll be showing in a little bit, we're illustrating general market-wide New York information, but districts and contractors, your fleets best, and so you can really tailor these assumptions to your specific context, and they will deliver distinct results. We can move to the next slide. Back to you.
Thanks, Michelle, and passing it over to Allison to give a quick overview of the Make Ready program, which we've talked about. Quickly, just to clarify, I think Allison will say this, but this is for those districts served by one of the major independently owned utilities in New York State, not necessarily those who are served by municipal or co-op providers.
Great. Thank you, Vinny, and thanks, Michelle. Hi, everybody. Really nice to be here today. I am going to give a brief overview of some Make Ready funding that the joint utilities have to help support the installation of charging infrastructure. As Vinny mentioned, the utilities are really trying to support the school districts as they electrify, and by stacking these incentives with the NYSBIP program and the EPA program, we're really trying to kind of spread these dollars to as many projects as possible. Also a plug just for establishing a relationship with your utility as soon as possible if you haven't already, if not for funding, then for helping with planning your project. I see a few bits in the chat there on that topic. So definitely important to work with them on planning and phasing and just working together to get charging installations in. So on the Make Ready pilot specifically, this is a program to help for medium and heavy duty vehicle charging infrastructure. It's 67 million statewide. The funding varies by utility. There's a website on the lower left that can give you details on the program generally, and also links to the program websites on each of the utility pages. Generally, the incentives are structured in a way to give different tiers to either publicly accessible sites, which is probably less likely to apply to school districts, but to private sites located in disadvantaged community. And we also can fund some utility side work for private sites if you're not in a DAC. The program requirements, and this is where we get to the stacking, is that it can be any charger type, any vehicle, any charger supporting a vehicle over 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. And if you check the box by participating in the NYSBIP program, then you have hit a gating criteria to be eligible for the pilot. So these are important incentives that can help on the charging infrastructure side and kind of layer on with the other funding that you are hopefully getting for your district. The next slide, please. So just to give another visual on those incentive tiers, we expect that most school districts will not be putting out publicly accessible sites if you have a depot that you're just using for your buses. So on this flow chart, assuming that you're kind of going over to the left here, the first question to ask is if you're already participating in a voucher incentive program. Assuming you are, because you're on this webinar and you've either gotten EPA funding or NYSBIP funding, really what's going to determine the level of incentive and whether you're being reimbursed for utility side cost or for customer side costs is that location of the depot in a disadvantaged community. And on the prior slide, there's some more education on what those are, and each utility should have a map of those locations. So really important to be aware of these incentives and to be able to stack them with the other funding streams that are out there. And the next slide, I think I will hand this back to Vinny.
Thanks, Allison. We're responding to some of the questions in the chat. Appreciate all the questions coming through, and we'll continue to answer those toward the end. Yeah, so this is just I think a useful diagram sort of describing what Allison was talking about, what I was talking about earlier in terms of what programs can cover what components. So in terms of utility side infrastructure, that's really, you know, the infrastructure and wires that get power to your site, to your property line. So the only thing that can fund that is the Make Ready program. It can cover up to 90% of these costs for school districts. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk about the cost of grid upgrades and, you know, how they are potentially insurmountable. This program is really designed to help with those grid upgrade costs. In addition to that, in some cases, as Allison laid out, Make Ready can also cover customer side costs. That includes anything that's on your site related to you know, your panel, conduit, you know, bringing power from your property line, you know, to where you're going to charge the buses ultimately. And so that can be covered in part by Make Ready in some cases, but also our New York School Bus Incentive Program does cover those same pieces of equipment and installations. And then in terms of the charger itself, NYSBIP is really what you would be using for the actual charger. Next slide, please. So this is an attempt at sort of clarifying the process of how you would apply to both our New York School Bus Incentive Program and the Utility Make Ready program. It's a lot of information, but you know, each of these programs have different application requirements and timelines. So we wanted to take a first pass and attempt at putting that on paper, showing you what it looks like, and trying to talk through it. And I will just caveat that throughout this entire process, our team and our voucher help center will be there to support you. Sure, the same is true for all the utilities. They're willing to support you in terms of the application process. So this may seem overwhelming, but bear with us, and we're here to support you. So I'm going to talk through this with Allison quickly. So you're submitting an application for your first bus. You submit that bus application, or it could be through our program, it could be through the EPA, it could be just self-funded. Once you have certainty that you're receiving a bus, you can then I'm sorry, I should back up. Just because the utility make ready programs do require that the buses are purchased through our program or the EPA programs as well. But once that application is approved and you're able to then go and talk to your utility about how that process goes. I'll hand it off to Allison to talk about the application process for Make Ready.
Great, thank you, Vinny. Yes, and just to double down on the collaboration that is available for you from the utilities, from NYSERDA, and as you can see, we're also working closely together to try to make this as seamless as possible. So once you've applied to the NYSERDA program and you have an approved application, you've now checked that box for that voucher program for eligibility. That's when you can apply to your utility for Make Ready funding, and also submitting engineering documents for our utility engineering review. We'll also do a quick plug again for those transportation electrification plans and utility pre-engagement advisory services that can help you understand what's needed and available for that project. This is where the utility, we will review the application for incentive levels and eligibility, and we will also complete the full engineering review of your project to determine what, if any, utility side upgrades are needed and what the scope of that is and the timeline. So that's an important piece for us to understand the timelines of your project and the eligibility, and what kind of costs, whether that's utility side or customer side or both, will be part of our program. And then I'll hand it off to Vinny for the next step.
Great. So we've sort of structured it in this way because we want to make sure that districts get all the money that they can. So once you've started that process with your utility, and you've got that eligibility determination from your utility, then you can come back to our New York School Bus Incentive Program charging portal and start your charging application. We'll include the documentation of Make Ready eligibility, and at this point your application is just essentially saying this is the amount you would qualify through our program, similar to the utility program. We want to make sure that we know that you're eligible for Make Ready and that determination has been made, and then we'll finalize the award amounts in the redemption process. So you start your application after you've received that eligibility determination from the utility, provide the documentation that's provided by the utility on your eligibility, and then you'll go back to the utility program.
Thanks, Vinny. And so these are the handoffs that we want to make smooth for you. And I imagine that a lot of these will be, be done in parallel. You'll be kind of working through this together. So we are just trying to put some structure here. So this is the point on step 6 where your project is fairly well finalized. You have a sense of the design, the costs, the final site plans and construction timelines and things like that. So that's when we will enter in kind of a formal contractual agreement with you for your final make ready incentive. For those of you who have gone through kind of light duty make ready programs, this will look and feel fairly similar. And this is really where we're kind of committing those funds and locking them in for your project, so that you can then go back to NYSERDA in step 7.
Right, and so with that program agreement, you can then come back to our NYSBIP application, and we'll have a funding amount that's approved for your application. Once those several steps are completed, this is the part where you get into the installation. Of course, we did not factor in permitting in this process, but that is obviously part of the process, as I mentioned earlier. But we're trying to talk about the handoffs between the utility and NYSERDA in this process. So with the approvals in hand, then you can purchase and install infrastructure. Ideally, that happens before you receive your bus or around the time that you're receiving your bus. And it's in step 9. So your dealer delivers the bus, and then you as the applicant would come back and close out the documentation to the utility and to NYSERDA in step 10. And then step 11, you'll receive a payment from the utility for the customer side work, as well as in step 12, you receive your reimbursements when you submit for voucher redemption through our New York School Bus Incentive Program. And that is the end of a very long process. Hopefully not long in actual time, but just our explanation of it. But should be the way to maximize the amount of funding you can receive for chargers and charging infrastructure. Anything else, Allison, to add on this?
No, I think we're good. Thank you.
Great. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to go through a few fund stacking scenarios to sort of show you how the programs work together and what amounts you receive for both. I know that there are some questions about this in the chat. Hopefully what we present answers those. And Michelle's gonna walk through the sort of the total cost of ownership portions of this after I present the upfront info. Next slide, please. Okay, so example 1, call it District 1, very simple name. District 1 is a 50% aid district, meaning that state aid covers about half of their transportation costs. Just for information, the median in New York State is around 70%, so this is assuming a slightly lower than normal amount of aid being provided. District 1 wants to buy a new Type D bus. These are the largest and most expensive types of buses available. Just for upfront information, a diesel Type D bus costs around $165,000, an electric version around $425,000. We can dispute these amounts. I'm sure they've gone up. I know for a fact that they've gone up, but these are sort of the averages off of the state contract right now that we're using for this example. District 1 is aware of the New York School Bus Incentive Program and also the IRS Commercial Clean Vehicle Tax Credit, which we'll talk about the specific amounts on the next slide. Okay, so this is going to involve a series of clicks, John. So District wants to purchase a Type D bus. You see the amounts there. Click, please. Okay, next. So then they apply for a NYSBIP voucher. The base amount for a Type D bus is $156,000. So we see that amount reduced from the electric school bus. On the next click. Next step. The district opts to scrap their old bus. So as part of our New York School Bus Incentive Program, there's a $65,000 bonus for scrapping. And we see that gets us down to around 200,000 compared to 165 still for the diesel. Next step is the district actually selected a vehicle to grid capable bus. That means the bus is able to send electricity back to the grid when that technology is available. That reduces the cost by another $13,000. Next step is factoring in the IRS tax credit, which is available as a direct pay up to $40,000 after other incentives are applied. So now we're below the cost of a diesel bus. And this is this is the final step in this example prior to state aid being calculated. And so at a 50% amount, the final cost to the district for both is around 75,000 for an electric school bus versus 82,500 for a diesel bus. That is, you might not be able to read the caveats at the bottom, but it's not factoring in interest on aid payments. It does not factor in the recent change to how NYSBIP vouchers are factored in. Both of those are actually going to reduce that upfront and overall cost to school districts purchasing an electric school bus. Once we finalize how that calculation is made, but yeah, significantly reduced cost. And as you can see, even upfront, before you get into the operating cost savings, an electric school bus can cost less than a diesel bus. Over to Michelle on the next slide to talk about total costs.
Yes, great. Thanks, Vinny. So here, this slide is just a bunch of the assumptions that are used to prepare an estimate of the total costs of operation. And again, wherever possible, we are drawing these from specific New York State context. So the sales tax is the New York State sales tax. The registration cost is the actual cost to register an electric and a diesel vehicle in the state of New York, etc. I'm happy to provide kind of more discussion of these later, or even better, the folks at NYSERDA and ourselves are happy to provide kind of extensive total cost of ownership guidance. But really the next slide is the one that is interesting. So if you can move along to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so here, what we've got, overall, this is just showing the total lifetime cost for a diesel bus on the left. So we've got in the green, the capital costs. In the, I think it should show up as like a pink or purple to you. Those are the maintenance and operations costs. And then in the orange is the fuel or electricity costs. So diesel is on the left. Over the lifetime, we're estimating that to operate this Type D vehicle, it would cost about $516,000 in today's dollars. In the middle is the electric without any subsidy or any incentive applied. And, again, that green in the middle, certainly very high. That's what we've been discussing today. And that's what the capital, why the capital costs are, typically such a barrier. And in fact, that upfront delta is well over $200,000. But if you look between the diesel on the left and the electric in the middle, you'll note that the top of these columns is much closer together than the top of these greens. And that's because over the lifetime of the electric bus, the operating costs are over $100,000 less than the diesel bus. So already we're kind of making up for that upfront premium, but there is still unsubsidized a premium to operate an electric vehicle. Whereas on the rightmost column bar, you can see what happens to the economic story when we layer on all of these incentives that are available in this example. And so, after accounting for the state vouchers, the charging and the bus voucher, as well as that, direct payable tax credit that Vinny mentioned at the beginning, that $40,000 from the IRS, these are those hashed portions in blue. You can see that the total cost comes way down, and we end up with a total cost of operating an electric bus that is much lower than the diesel. Specifically with the incentives, the district is saving almost $125,000 over the lifetime of the bus compared to buying a new diesel bus. This doesn't even account for, we played it conservative. So the electricity costs here are they are assuming no managed charging, which, if you do your fleet electrification planning and you talk to your utility, you're certainly going to embrace the benefits of managed charging, which can have that orange bar there even further. And then additionally, we talked about this being a V2G capable charger. So that opens up the opportunity to participate in some of the potentially revenue creating or, further cost minimizing utility programs that folks like Allison and the other utilities may be able to offer you. So, this is showing a relatively conservative story, and yet we're still seeing that with these great incentives provided by the state, a very compelling economic case to move to electric now. And so that's just how we kind of talk through the total cost story when we think about electric school buses. And yeah, I'm happy. I see in the chat a question about the lifetime. And so here, if you go back one slide, we can just quickly review these assumptions. Thank you. Yeah, so we're looking at a 12-year lifetime, which is the same as comes in the NYSERDA roadmap. And we are looking at 16,000 miles a year, which is supposedly, purportedly roughly average. But again, these are things that you'll want to specify for your district, and they may, tell a different story. And yeah, I can probably follow. It might be easier on the maintenance and operations costs. These are from the NYSERDA roadmap study, and then the World Resources Institute, my organization, does have additional research that suggests actually slightly lower numbers, but of course, New York State, is maybe more expensive than the rest, a national average. So, yeah, but I'll pass it back to Vinny now for the next example.
Thanks, Michelle. And yeah, just noting that, we'll also share some tools that are available that Michelle uses on some of these calculations, and also sort of a charging cost tool that is available from Con Edison at the end of this presentation. But we're also available to help with more specific or customized cases too. Sorry, next slide. I'm going to go through this one very quickly because we're almost at time. Sorry, next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so this is an even more conservative district in terms of the amount of aid that they're due. They want to purchase a Type C bus. Our upfront cost assumptions are $145,000 for Type C versus $385 for a Type C electric. This district's applying for the EPA Clean School Bus rebate. Hopefully this answers the questions in the chat about how we determine sort of the stacking voucher amounts. So they get an EPA Clean School Bus rebate, they get the stacking voucher from NYSERDA, and then they apply the commercial clean vehicle tax credit after both of those. Next slide. All right, so in interest of time, John, maybe just click through all of these until you get to the final line. Thanks. And so as you can see here, the upfront cost is 385. That gets reduced by the EPA non-priority district award amount. So that's what determines what your stacking voucher amount is. Right now, the EPA's Clean School Bus program offers $200,000 for a non-priority district and $345,000 for a priority district. Our stacking vouchers account for some of that difference. So if you're an EPA non-priority district, you receive up to $100,000, and for an EPA priority district, it would be up to $50,000, given that significant increase or increased amount offered for an EPA priority district. So in this case, the total upfront incentive from EPA and from the New York School Bus Incentive Program is $300,000. So that brings the electric school bus cost down to $85,000. And the diesel equivalent is still $142,000. Then you apply the 45W credit to the remaining cost. That brings it down to $45,000. Again, factoring in the lower aid ratio here, but not factoring in the change to how aid is calculated. You're looking at $33,000, around 33 versus 106 for a diesel or gas bus. Again, that will be reduced even further due to the aid changes. Next slide, and Michelle, quickly, the 1-minute version of the.
Yeah, I think we can move right
Yeah.
through this one, and maybe just move to the next slide. I guess while we're flipping slides, I'll note that we made sure to include, everyone is used to operating diesel buses and knows that, there are ongoing maintenance on operation for your diesel. Of course, when we're thinking about moving electric, you also will need to be maintaining and operating and, spending funds on your charger as well as the bus itself. And so we do include those costs here. And, the punchline of this one is the same. We're looking at significant over the lifetime savings. When you go electric, utilizing the many grant and incentive and voucher and rebate opportunities that are available in this particular example. Back to you.
Thanks. Okay, so we went a little bit longer than we anticipated. Next slide, please. We've been trying to answer some of the questions throughout this and in the chat. As I mentioned, please follow up with us if you have specific questions or want specific total cost of ownership scenarios put together. We're here to help with that information. Next slide, please. And these are just some upcoming events. The Electric School Bus Technical Conference, this is being put on by the Joint Utilities, which Con Ed is part of, the other major utilities across the state, to talk about capacity analysis that's being undertaken and the larger context of how districts are preparing, how utilities are preparing for electrification of buses and other large vehicles. That's on May 31st. We have additional webinars in this series coming up in June and July, and we'll probably schedule further ones after that. Our next one, I believe, is on the charging voucher redemption process, so how you receive reimbursement for your charging costs. We have additional resources available. I mentioned that our financial incentives guide will be updated soon. Just a reminder to contact your utility. There's links to all the major utility contact info, our NYSBIP incentive program. I mentioned that, and I think Michelle mentioned that the total cost of ownership tools are available online, and also Con Edison has a charging rate calculator, which is a really nifty tool. I will caveat that it's specific to Con Ed's territory in terms of the rates, but also just helpful to show sort of how total costs are calculated in a similar way. And that is it. Our last slide just has contact info for some of us, but Also, as I said, we'll be posting these slides to our website. You can reach out to me if you need contact info for somebody else or another organization at schoolbus@nyserda.ny.gov. We appreciate all of the comments and questions we've received, and also your time. I know we're a little bit over, but thank you again, and we'll follow up once the slides are available online. Thank you. And thank